There was so many people who joined in a matter of 3 seconds. I don't know if you guys were expecting me to sit here and tell you that you shouldn't be vegan. I don't know what you expected me to say. Did you want something? No. I had that big ass brain.
Oh,
The bird with the big ass brain. They kicked me because the guy. I don't know. They were big on anti-capitalism, and I told them that if we had anti-capitalism, people would become mass junkies, or junkies would overdose, and then we wouldn't have. How would I explain it? Well, basically, the end result, it resulted in the head person getting butthurt because of me using examples as meth head Mike and junkie Jonathan as ways to assume something. I don't know how to explain it, but basically, Mod got mad. Yeah. So I'm confused. Can
hey,
I?
Bentham, can you hear me, Bentham?
Yep, I can.
Hear
All
everybody,
right,
man.
cool. Yeah, we're just working out some technical stuff. Apparently Discord's
No,
bugging out now.
I can hear him now. I had my fucking volume all the way down.
Yeah, take
Yeah.
whatever time you need. Just let me know whenever, if there's anything I can do, and whenever we can get started.
What are
Yeah.
we doing?
Be good to go here. Let's go to stage.
Oh, let's go to the stage.
Oh,
All right. All right. So we need to get Bentham on the stage. Okay. Bentham is requesting to speak. You're invited to speak, Bentham. You got to accept the invite. There we go. Perfect.
And it's all good? All
And
right, cool.
we should be good to go.
All right, cool. So thank you so much for the debate invitation or challenge, however one wants to say it, and also for this opportunity to inspire me to do a lot more reading into and research on threshold deontology. I'll tell you that I went into this with a distinctly negative view of threshold deontology, but after having read through some of Ross, after watching in particular, your interview you had with that PhD student a while back, I'll say that I have a lot of respect for what threshold deontology attempts to capture and the sort of moral beliefs that it is attempting to systematize, even though I personally believe that utilitarianism can more effectively can take account of those things. I just want to say thank you so much for this opportunity and for everything related to that. And if it might be helpful, we can get started. I've got like around 3 questions. I think like it'd be great for us to explore here. Mm-hmm. So the first of these questions is
sure.
Yeah, sorry. That is, how do you derive your deontic obligations? And so maybe we can like go straight into that. are these obligations that
Mhm.
you arrive at through? I know you said you're not an intuitionist, but are they things you arrive at through the sort of like intuition, personal intuitions, or is there some sort of unifying principle that supplies you with obligations such as to keep promises or to not steal or whatever other obligations you
Mhm.
consider to be a part
Sure.
of threshold deontology?
Yeah, yeah. It seems, just before I answer that question, it seems like you're using like intuitionism as like analogously as like some subjective like attitude, um,
Yeah, yeah.
or feeling or whatnot.
We can separate them out because I know that they're distinct, or maybe like your subject. Do they come each individual obligation from a subjective attitude, or is there a unifying principle that itself is sort of the subjective is arrived at through subjective attitude? I guess that's my question.
So there are yeah. So there's two approaches you can take here. So just to before we go on, so yeah, intuitionism, I take that to be a form of justification. So it would be in like something like a non-inferential justification or whatnot. Um, there may be other like views of intuitionism, but I'm a subjectivist. So in terms of like what makes something right, that's going to be a question for both threshold deontologists and deontologists alike. Me personally, there are certain um, principles that do govern, and I probably should have given you this video before the debate. They do govern when something becomes a obligatory as opposed to supererogatory rights violation. It has to do with some. Guess what? It's another threshold that comes that is derived between when there's a difference in um, the degree of disutility for oneself versus the degree of utility for the other individual. And past a certain threshold, it's something would look obligatory. To give you an example of this, let's say you saw someone who was poor. And if you could snap your fingers, the person would be $1 richer. However, you have arthritis. So if you were to snap your fingers, it would cause you pain. However, they would have an extra dollar in their pocket. And let's just say that the extra dollar in their pocket would result in a net increase in utility. I would say that snapping your fingers if you had arthritis would be a supererogatory action. It would be good, but it wouldn't be obligatory. It wouldn't be an obligation that you would have to do. However, if you increase the amount of dollars in this person's pocket, or the amount of dollars in everyone's pocket to a point where like everyone would just be like, you would end starvation and whatnot, yada yada yada. I would say even if you had arthritis, it would be obligatory for you to snap your finger and undergo the pain because there's some sort of differential. There's some sort of ratio differential between you and the other individuals in terms of the disutility of yourself versus utility to the other individuals. So those types of rights are governed by a principle, not just particular. However, there are some rights that are particular, and those tend to be negative rights violations. Negative rights violations, on my view, tend to be just atomistic. They're these discrete particular things governed by my attitudes on a subjectivist view. And on my own same subjectivist view, I capture positive obligations through a generalizable principle. By subjectivism, I just mean I'm talking about ethical subjectivism, which is the conjunction of three theses. Number one, moral statements express propositions. Two, at least one of those propositions are true. Three, the truth maker of these propositions is the summation of the normative attitudes of the subject in this case being me. Although there are other ways of deriving deontic rights. It's not, you don't have to be a subjectivist to be a threshold deontologist, but since the question was directed toward me specifically, that's how I get to it.
All right, thank you so much. So I guess returning back to the idea of those the positive rights. So those sorts of ones are whether or not somebody has a positive right to some sort of action from you, and whether or not it's a obligatory supererogatory. That sort of is done purely based off of based off of the utility? Is that sort of like a so do you view like positive actions you take as being as being a utility calculation? But then I guess like my question is, how do you decide on what is the threshold between supererogatory and obligatory there? Because that feels like that's its own sort of that's its own sort of non-consequentialist obligation that I'm still a bit curious about like where that exactly comes from.
Well, before we get to where that comes from, I'll just point out that it's not a thing that only deontologists consider. Like, these are questions that utilitarians engage with all the time. When is the difference becomes obligatory versus supererogatory? There are utilitarians that view certain actions as even increasing a slight amount of utility to be obligatory. But then there are plenty of utilitarians that want to try to make the case that a slight amount of utility is not this obligatory thing, that it would just be a supererogatory thing. So the supererogatory versus obligatory kind of calculus is not limited to deontic or threshold deontic normative theories. There are utilitarians that engage in this kind of discussion all the time. And where it comes from is going to be, it's just going to be derivative of, on my view, is derivative of my attitudes. Just like I think any subjectivist utilitarian, it's going to be derivative of their attitudes if they want to draw a obligatory versus supererogatory distinction. If I personally cash it out with positive rights, and so that's, for me, it's going to be a threshold that is met, and the threshold is going to, like the normal threshold of threshold deontology, is just going to be derivative of the individual values of the two things that go into the equation. How do I get to those two things in the equation? Well, that's the question for any normative theory. On my view, it's a subjectivist account, which is just going to be my values. It doesn't have to be the only way you take it into account, but do you get what I'm saying before we go on? Like, the point is that whatever threshold you draw up, it's just going to be trivially derivative by the individual principles that form the threshold.
Yeah, and at its core, like, you are like a subjectivist. So the so it's like at the end of sort of like the line of reasoning, there is that sort of like, this is a expression of my preferences, and that's going to be the same for the positive rights as well as the negative rights. And
well, before we get there,
sorry.
That's not what I'm trying to get across. But before we get there, what I'm saying is that if there are two principles that are being valued differently, and there are and we're dealing with these contrasting principles, the question of where the threshold is just going to be derivative of the values of those different principles that are forming it.
Okay, I understand you.
That's
I guess like that gets into like. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. So what I'm saying is that it's not just that I'm taking, like, I'm looking in like, oh well, the threshold is like, here's, I'm just going to pull this out and just the threshold's there. Like, no, the threshold is something that it's just a construct that's derivable. It's something that's derivable that just follows from things that are already valued. So the real question is, well, what are the values of those things that are forming the threshold? Because depending on what the value of these different principles are, the threshold's going to be at different locations. And so that's the real question. But you'll notice that question is just as much of a question for threshold deontology as it is for the conjunction of the normative theories that compose it. The degree to which the utilitarians figure out the value of utility, and the degree to which the deontologists figure out the value of obligations, that's just going to be the degree to which I figure out, well, it is figured out where the threshold is. Now, on my view, I can give you my account of it, but you'll notice that it's just going to be derivative from what I consider the value of utility and what I consider the value of rights obligation. So that will form the threshold. And what is my valuation of rights violations? What is my valuation of utility? Well, I can give you that account, but you'll ask, well, why do I have that account? Why do I value utility this much, and why do I value rights obligations this much? And the answer for me is just going to be a subjectivist account. I can give you other ways of quote unquote grounding threshold deontology. There's going to be like numerous ways actually. That's one of the common myths that people put out, that there's this grounding problem for threshold deontology that is in some way different from things like utilitarianism or deontology. I strongly reject that. But to answer the question, this is how I derive those thresholds. I derive the thresholds from its constitutive principles, and my valuation for those constitutive principles trivially fixes where the threshold is, and how I derive the valuation of those constitutive principles is just going to be a subjectivist account.
Okay, I understand you there, and I don't think there's like really much of a need for us to get into deep meta ethical discussions of like attacking subjectivism or anything such as that. Particularly since each of us, like whatever our like meta ethics, do arrive at the value for utility and for general welfare, even if we just differ on whether or not we end up valuing the deontic obligations like as ends in and of themselves. And so I guess I like to refer a bit to some of the stuff that you said in your interview with his name escapes me, but the excellent PhD student
Tyler Blake Cook.
Tyler Blake Cook, yeah. And when you were talking there, you spoke a little bit about how you arrived at threshold deontology because, as opposed to utilitarianism, it seemed to better sort of capture your subjectivist like impulses. That with utilitarianism, when you reach when you reached sort of the extremes, you realized, hey, I don't actually think that is right. I don't think it's right to do this extreme measure just because it slightly increases utility. Am I giving like a fair representation of like of how you arrived at it?
Yeah, mostly. The way I view it is I think I arrived at it because I viewed certain things as like on my subjectivist account as rights violations. And I didn't think that, some of these things, that hypotheticals, even divorced of any of the type of escape routes that utilitarians typically try to take in these hypotheticals, even if those weren't there, I feel appalled. My attitudes were appalled. My normative attitudes were appalled at the answers that utilitarians were giving to these hypotheticals. And then I didn't know what to call it, but I'm like, well, wait a minute, this can't be right. There's got to be some sort of other principle that's constitutive of my values.
Yeah, and like I can understand absolutely having that response. I guess like the way that I see it is that I view utilitarianism. I think that you can give a sort of subjectivist account of utilitarianism that's similar to what you're talking about, but I'll try to elucidate a way in which I think that it's a little bit better. It's a little bit better grounded in sort of like baseline values. I'm sorry, I'm like using a lot of language that
when you say grounded, what do you mean?
Okay, yeah. I guess what I mean is like the way I see utilitarianism is I try to identify what is it that I consider valuable in myself. I come to account like, oh, that pleasure and pain are two things which I have no choice but to value. That these are things which are action urging impulses that force me to place some degree of value upon them. And then I construct out from that I see that certain actions such as eating, such as drink, such as all different things tend to bring these like emotional states for me and tend to give me these like positive impressions. And I also see that people around me seem to also have those particular types of responses. And so I extrapolate out from this that other people experience the same sort of pleasure and pain that I have. And I basically construct it out from I value pleasure, I value pain, and that any sort of rules that I create based upon that, any sort of rights that I give based upon that, are in the end an expression of that central value. And I guess like what
So
like the
when
way,
so when you
yeah,
say
sorry, go on.
ground, do you just mean the things that capture your subjectivist values?
I like for the purposes of this argument, I think that we can like that we can stick with that, and I think that that could be like that still could be useful. And I guess like I don't think it's like useful to like argue with you like, oh no, your subjective preferences should be this instead of like something else. But that, apologies, just a second. There was a notification I had to get rid of. But that instead, I would think that the duties that you view as valuable could be derived also from a utilitarian lens. Like, for instance, that I view it as I view the like I could say I view some of the extremes of like hypothetical and utilitarianism as monstrous, not necessarily because I view I view there to be these like fundamental like deontic values that I see as like important in and of themselves, but that it is impossible for me to imagine living in a world where there would not be a sort of precedential value to the choices that I make
So let's.
within these areas. Sorry,
I
sorry.
have
Go
to,
ahead.
yeah,
You
just to
can
cut you off. So
you can challenge me on
I
stuff.
really I really do want to, not just for the sake of the discussion, like I really do want to know what you mean by grounded. The reason I'm pushing you on
Sure.
this is because if you're going to try to make the case that one is somehow more quote unquote grounded than the other, I really do need to know what you mean. Because if you're going to say that by grounded I just mean that it captures my values, well, I could grant that. It may very well be the case that utilitarianism captures your values, your subjective values, more than threshold deontology. That's fine. I grant that there are plenty of people out there that have their values grounded. And by grounded, we just mean that utilitarianism matches their subjective values more than it would be another theory. But then it would also be the case that threshold deontology for me is more grounded than utilitarianism. So what I'm looking for is if that's all you mean, then fine. Then for me, TD will be more grounded than utilitarianism. For you, utilitarianism will be more grounded than TD, and that's all fine and good. But what I'd be interested in is if there's some kind of argument that utilitarianism is somehow more grounded in any other sense. So that's why it's really important to like not just like do this like for the sake of the argument thing. Like here, like we really need to get to the bottom. Like, okay, well, if we want to make some kind of case here that one is more grounded than the other, then here's what we mean by grounded, and here's how one is more grounded than the other. But if we want to drop the claim, then that's fine too.
Okay, so I guess like I'm trying to think of exactly the way to express this. That okay, maybe this will be helpful. So when I think of the deontic obligations that you talk about, such as to keep a promise, such as to do this or to do that, what I see there is, and again, like I'm going to be talking about like again my own like subjectivist framing of this, because I think like that's a bit valuable. When I say like more grounded, I don't mean that I think that there is some sort of like a moral realist sort of argument for utilitarianism. So I guess like I'll say like I'm not going to like use that wording anymore, because again like it's very charged and it brings forward a sort of moral realist framing that I don't really think it's like valuable to get into here, and I don't necessarily think even I agree with. But simply that when I think of a deontic obligation, such as, again, I'll return to keeping a promise, I view keeping a promise as a thing that has a socially constructed value within the society that I grew up in, that I grew up around people and in the society where it was told to me, it's valuable to keep your promises. It's valuable to do this. And like, I agree that there's a value to keeping your promises. But from my perspective, the value in that is not the rule itself that, in a way, I think I have been conditioned in order to view as valuable, but from the good outcomes that it brings. And I guess the one strong issue I have, even from from a subjectivist lens with threshold deontology, is I fear that it much more easily than utilitarianism can allow for the introduction of some sort of perceived values, perceived obligations that come not from a recognition of what is sort of intrinsically valuable in the self. And when I say intrinsically, I mean simply is something that is valuable in yourself, regardless of the social context you're in and regardless of the culture you're born in, but something that is conditioned in a way where I think, like, for an example, in the past, I think people could be conditioned in a way to view it as certain, like, obligations, like a father to protect his daughter. It's my obligation to protect her from, like, predatory other men, and then they can use that as a justification for instance, like keeping their daughter within the home, or like suppressing her rights in ways that we would now view as problematic. I worry that by having this sort of subjectivist account that has these sort of rights that we sort of adopt that we sort of adopt just from, like, subjective preference, without going to what we view as valuable in and of ourselves, separate from that society. I think that's something that just
So
concerns me.
if I could reproduce what you're saying, yeah. So you would say that, so we've abandoned the grounding claim. Do we have, like, agreement on that?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay. All right. So the grounding claim is off the table. There's no case to be made here that one is more grounded than the other. Okay. And then what the issue is that, on a threshold deontic view compared to a utilitarian view, that these deontic rights are really just, are not coming from some more fundamental, more innate type of human psychology. They're coming from some interaction with society that's fixing the attitudes. And that's what makes it true on a subjectivist account, rather than some of the utilitarian concerns, which seem that they're more innate. They seem that there are going to be um, more primitive values. That if, for example, if you took someone and just grew them up divorced of a society, they would still. It's very hard to imagine them not valuing pleasure and pain. But it may be a little bit tougher to get them to imagine that divorced of society, they would value things like keeping a promise or something like that. Is that the kind of concern that there is?
Yes, I think that's a fair representation of it.
Okay. So I don't actually see this on the net as a problem. In fact, I may see this idea to only capture the primitive attitudes as morally worthy as actually more of a problem. I'm not. So the ultimate question is going to be, why would I want to only capture my primitive attitudes rather than my socially constructed attitudes? I understand there's going to be some concerns that, well, depending on the society I'm in, sometimes I may have that they may have conditioned values that I may reflect upon and be like, wait a minute, I don't agree with that at all. Um, However, if I were to divorce myself from all of my socially conditioned attitudes, I actually would also be very fearful of where I might end up. Just imagine me ending up in some area where I only feel pleasure and pain, and I only and yeah, I could reason out certain things that are derivative of pleasure and pain. I'm very, very horrified, actually, where that would lead, though, if I were to divorce myself of any of the non-primitive attitudes that I have. So, for example, I can give some examples if you'd like. They would just be any of the classical utilitarian reductios that really, in scenarios where really utilitarians can't use excuses. So, if we were in a hypothetical situation where we could enslave half the population to slightly increase utility, if I were to just only account for my primitive attitudes, which would, in this case, we're just stipulating they would be pleasure and pain, I would conclude that, well, on the net, well, first of all, I wouldn't really even, if just the primitive attitudes, I wouldn't even really, it might push me into egoism, but that's another concern. Um, but even if it didn't push me into egoism, even if it was just the net calculus, I would still be horrified by it. And I understand that the reason I might be horrified by enslaving this population, it may just be a non-primitive concern, a non-primitive attitude that's socially constructed. That's fine. I'm okay with that. So I do recognize that there may be certain openings for weaknesses for valuing non-primitive concerns, non-primitive psychological attitudes. However, I'm equally, if not more, concerned what my moral system would look like if I divorced myself from the non-primitive concerns.
So I understand where you're getting at from this. I guess I guess the way that I'd respond to that is that when you talk about the extreme negative outcomes of as adopting only, I'll use your terminology, the primitive concerns of pleasure and pain. Those outcomes can only be viewed as negative from the outsider lens of including, like you said, the other values that are created through social construction. Whereas when I think of those values that come from the society that we live in, those I guess you could say adopted values as opposed to primitive values. Maybe that could be a good terminology for this. But those adopted values from our society, that creating a system utilizing those adopted values as ends in and of themselves can. Sorry, I'm getting my thoughts together here. Can end up can end up causing outcomes that are. My apologies. I'm just thinking this through. That can end up causing moral intuitions and outcomes that can be negative, on the face of. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. I'll try and go down another route. I apologize for that.
Well, let me actually push you. Let me actually do. I'm going to bring up, now that I thought about it more. I'm going to bring up the egoist issue, because, if we are only going to consider primitive attitudes, if that's the case, then I also don't see how, in principle, we might just be egoists, because it seems like the reasons for, instead of just being an egoic utilitarian, someone might be a classical utilitarian, where they care about the net for all individuals. It seems like that's socially constructed, because I don't know why anyone who would divorce themselves from non-primitive concerns, I don't know why they would care about being a classical utilitarian rather than an egoic utilitarian. And even if you want to say something like, well, it's a means to an end, but in situations where the means isn't to that end, it's just going to collapse into egoic utilitarianism. So, if we have this primitive tribal. Yeah,
I don't see it as necessarily collapsing into egoism, because the way that I view it is that when I see things within myself that I value, such as pleasure and such as pain, the thing that I am valuing is not the specific instance of my pleasure or the specific instance of my pain. That what I'm forced to adopt them as values in order to engage with the world, I am valuing the concepts of pleasure and of pain, rather than just the pleasure and the pain as instance within myself. And so, to the extent that I can view what appear to be other beings within the world that appear to themselves, through their representations and through their actions, embody those, that appear to experience those same feelings that I myself have recognized as valuable in myself, I view it, since I am valuing the concept of pleasure or pain, I view it as inconsistent for me to then arbitrarily limit it to the extent of only my own phenomenological experience. So long as I have a reasonable degree of certainty that other creatures around in the world experience those same things which I have already placed a value upon. I know that a lot of people argue like that egoism and utilitarianism, there's a very slippery slope from the latter to the former, but I don't necessarily view that as the case if you like take this particular route of argument.
Well, the issue is just going to be if you look at individuals that are divorced from society, it's just going to be an empirical one in terms of like it's so the empirical question here is just going to be like, well, um, if you're only considering attitudes that are not formed on a societal basis, um, the best way to see what they do and don't value are to actually look at individuals divorced from society from beginning to end. And if you do look at that, they seem to be operating more, maybe not perfectly egoic utilitarians, but they do seem to operate more, or at least plenty of their actions seem to be egoic utilitarian. And they do engage in actions that I think we both would be horrified with. And you may say, well, that's just because of our societal norms, and I just don't see a problem with that. But
So I
like that,
I don't
yeah, go ahead.
necessarily, I think the framing you're doing here, because while yes, if you put somebody out and raise them as like a feral person or raise them within a society that is cut off from the rest of the world, I think naturally that's going to result in them acting in a more tribalistic or egoic manner because they aren't given the opportunity to recognize the true presence of that which they value in themselves in others. That through interacting with others in a more sophisticated environment where you're more able to communicate with them and understand from their communications with
You mean
you,
a society?
yes, that through building that society, you are able to sort of like to recognize the value of what you value in yourself in them. And I want to make it clear that when I talk about valuing, like adopting your terminology of valuing the primitive, I'm not saying that I think we should return to monkey and that we should, in our actual practical moral choices, return to something that came before what we currently experience. What I would simply argue for instead is to sort of reconstruct our second order preferences, desires, or reconstruct the values that we have, such as, for instance, to not tell lies, such as to keep promises that you make to others, but reconstruct them based upon the degree to which they serve that baseline first value of avoiding pain and seeking pleasure. Like that's what I intend to say.
Here are the questions then. So I think what you're trying to say, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that okay? Well, the reason is because society gives people tools in order to like form some logical extensions of their primitive desires. So it could be that people who are divorced from society are just acting just more quote unquote primitively because they have primitive desires, but they're not able to use the certain tools to extend them to generalize to other certain second order conclusions based on their primitive desires. It doesn't mean they're working. So it doesn't mean you would engage in these same behaviors. Okay, so is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, so far, yeah.
Okay, so I have a couple of questions. So number one, the ultimate question here is the same, which is why should I care to only value primitive values rather than non-primitive values? That's question number one. Question number two is how do we know that the deontic values are not primitive themselves, as opposed to only being utilitarian, being primitive? And then question number three: how do we know that these second order? Actually, those are the two main questions. So the question number one is really the main one. Why should I care? And then two is what basis do we have to say that the deontic values are primitive? Are non-primitive rather than also primitive. And then actually, here's the third. The third one is what's our basis for saying that the second order values that we are trying to preserve on a utilitarian view, what's the basis for saying that they are non-primitive rather than primitive?
Okay, so I think like if we're like when you say primitive, I assume you like yeah, I think we're pretty clear on what that means. So I guess like I could appeal to the fact that, for instance, that animals that when maybe this is going
Well,
down a
which
direction that
question are we answering before we go
oh,
on?
okay,
We
okay.
can go like one by one.
This is answering the question of why deontic values are not as primitive as the utilitarian values, or
Okay.
so yeah. So like if you look, for instance, to the behavior of animals, they are unable to create. They don't experience theory of mind, and because of that, um, they are unable to create the sort of social structures that create the sort of deontic values, such as keeping promises, because they don't understand what a promise is. They don't understand what it is to make have a duty to some other being, because they don't recognize other beings. They may not even recognize themselves as beings. However, even in this sort of this is maybe a different use of the word primitive than you
I'm
meant.
actually not sure. Well, I'm actually not sure that's true. There are certain experiments where animals kind of like pay each other back with food and stuff. Like I'm not sure. So that is an. I just want to flag that as an empirical claim.
Okay.
But but the there's also animals that have been like filmed like saving other animals. Um, but it could. I mean, you could all. It's just underdetermined whether that's going to be from some primitive utility value versus like some deontic value. Um, but I wasn't. I also wasn't aware that we're like cashing primitive out in terms of like just what animals value. But we can work with that if that's your view.
Okay, so like how does
Um,
that differ from what you meant by primitive in when you were first describing it?
oh yeah, I was referring to the values humans would have if divorced from
Okay.
society. Yeah. But if you want to say primitive as in like the type of values non-human animals would have, then we can work with that. It just depends on where you want to go.
Okay, like I'll stick with like humans if they were divorced from society, because I think like that would be like since that better
Yeah,
captures what you initially meant and really what
yeah.
I was initially trying to say with that you described as primitive values. So like
Okay.
I guess like I would appeal again like when I was initially talking about how people who live away from society would act in like egoistic manners, that what the
Hmm.
reason why they're doing that is because like I stated that it's because they don't recognize others as being beings in and of themselves, and that because of that they would also not recognize others as things that they would keep promises to or that they would have specific duties to, because they would not see others as beings that experience states similar to their own, and that the only extent they
Let
do that
me
is
ask
probably through
you a
egoism.
question.
Sorry, go ahead. Yeah,
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah. So do you think so? The issue here is we have the same underdetermination in both cases. So when I talk to you about collapsing into egoism in the primitive context, you pushed back, and your pushback was that, well, it's not necessarily that the primitive values are just going to be egoic. It could just be that they're non-egoic, but society is giving us tools to realize our values and or realize our the derivative values from our primary primitive values. Um, Now, the issue is why can't the same thing be said here for the deontic concerns? Maybe the people who are divorced from society are not acting with deontic rights for the same reason that they're not acting based on the second order utilitarian values that you want to preserve. Maybe society has just not given them the tools to connect their primitive values to realize their deontic values. And maybe there really are, maybe these deontic values really are primitive. If you want to say that the values you're trying to preserve are primitive, and your excuse and your explanation is just going to be that society gives them the tools to figure out their primitive values. Why can't I say the same thing for the deontic values? Why can't I say that, well, in society they would just have more tools, and they would derive the deontic values from the primitive values?
Ah, I see what you mean here. So I didn't mean that through society we discover our primitive values. I meant that through society and through connecting with others, interacting with others, we discover that our primitive values that which we value in ourselves is also present in others. So it's not creating a new value. Like when it moves from the egoism to the utilitarianism, it's
Hmm.
not like I am valuing a new concept. It's simply that previously I was under the impression that I was the only being. I would view like a creature that does not have theory of mind as essentially like equivalent to a metaphysical solipsist. That they don't view others as experiencing anything. But once they do, then a utilitarian goes, okay, by valuing the same thing, pleasure and pain, I'm now expanding it to n doesn't equal one, n equals whatever number of
Well, I can.
creatures I
Yeah,
recognize
that's
as
okay.
having
That's
that.
yeah. Yeah, I understand the clarification. I do just repeat. So I still don't understand how it gets out of the situation. So why can't I say the same thing for deontology then? Well, I can say, well, maybe there are really primitive deontic concerns that everyone has. So, for example, like maybe people really do not want to die as some sort of like they just view the inherent action of their dying being wrong. That's their value. Um, and when they go into society, um, then well, they see other people, and then they are stepping it up from n equals one. They're saying, okay, well, this person probably also like just views their death to be just this inherently wrong thing, or views their murder to be this inherently wrong thing. Um, and you can say, well, maybe that's due to the utilitarian primitive values. Maybe it is. Maybe it's not. I just want to know what the argument is then for the same kind of procedure being done for deontic.
So I guess like the way I see it is I don't think deontic values they at least like maybe you could clarify. I don't think they make sense to me for a solipsist. Like for a creature that doesn't have the concept of other creatures existing, the idea of keeping a promise or of not stealing from somebody, that doesn't really have any meaning because there's no other like deontic values seem to me to be relations between beings. And I don't see how that could be the same as a primitive value of my own pleasure and pain, because you'd have to expand n to be over one in order to be able to have the sorts of relations that create deontic values.
Yeah. So, well, first of all, I just flagged that to point out that that depends on one's view of whether deontic rights can be cashed out only between two different moral agents. Or what a moral specifying what a moral agent is, because there are some views that deontic rights violations or obligations may be able to obtain between a certain proper subset of non-moral agents. So it may not be the case necessarily that a solipsist would be divorced of all deontic values. So that's going to be, you're going to have to do work there to get to that view. There's going to be contention you're going to find with that. And then I'll just flag the second, because we still seem to be on the I believe this is the second question. I'll just flag that the first question still applies, which is the why should I care question.
Why should you care about why should you care about like pleasure and pain, you mean? Or
no, why should I care about why should I care to only have values that are the values that would obtain if humans were divorced from society?
so okay, like I think now might be a valuable time to go on to there because I think we've kind of reached bedrock when it comes to the other.
Before we do,
go ahead.
Well, I don't, because I don't think we have reached bedrock on the other one. Yeah. So yeah, the question is why can't, like, here's where we're at. So we're at the empirical question. Like, okay, well, these values may be why is it that deontic values are not values that someone who, like, if this human was just born out of society on their own, how do we know that they wouldn't have any deontic values and all of their values would just be these utilitarian values? That's the empirical question.
Okay, so I guess could you refer to me back to like the evidence that I think you referred to some sort of evidence of animals sort of like keep expressing these sorts of values between one another. Could you expand a bit upon that?
Yeah. So sure. So there's, for example, there's certain video evidences of animals of different species, so they're not in this like weird society with each other. where like one animal would see another animal drowning and they would help them out of the water, and even look concerned at them. Um, this is divorced from a common society. This is divorced from a common species. And so, like, why would that example? Now, certainly, we can cash this out in terms of an understanding of a primitive example of utilitarianism. They can say, well, and empathy. So they can say, okay, well, n equals one. This is me. I wouldn't want to drown, or drowning would cause me pain or whatnot, and I therefore like extrapolate that to like having some empathy toward toward this other being of a different species. So when a primate or something like takes a rodent or a bird or something that's like drowning in the water and pulls them out. So we can cash it out there. We could also cash it out in terms of some sort of like like proto deontic rights violation, just as easily as we can some proto understanding of utility. So there seems to be an underdetermination there. And so the question is, how do we resolve that underdetermination such that it works out in your favor? Such that we can say, okay, well, these primitive values that these humans would have if divorced from a society, or B, these animals would have, um, that are divorced from their animal society or whatnot. How do we resolve the underdetermination from saying, okay, well, these things are explained by a proto utilitarian understanding rather than some proto deontic understanding?
Okay, so like to respond to that, I guess like the I have two main arguments for this. The first one would simply be an appeal to the preponderance of evidence for the existence of certain values. Like I think that the preponderance of evidence for the existence of pleasure and of pain and of the action urging consequences of that in animals is very, very strong. We can see it before our eyes, the actions of animals in response to specific stimuli and what appear to be a negative phenomenological, what appears to represent a negative phenomenological experience. Now, I'd have to look more at like what you're referring to in terms of animals seeming to fulfill obligations they feel towards those other animals, but I would say that even if like this exists in like some cases, it doesn't seem to. The fact is, like you mentioned, you could cash that out as simply those animals acting with a sort of sympathy that's based upon serving their own desires or serving their own ideas of those sort of like of those sort of proto-utilitarian motivations. And I would say that without strong evidence of this being a sustained and very like common thing throughout like how animals operate, assuming that that is an example of a proto-deontic like obligation like at work is something that I think might be a little bit of a stretch when we have simply much more evidence of what appears to be the primitive nature of the like hedonic states of pleasure and pain. And I guess the second argument I'd make is that I still don't quite understand how one can conceive of having a duty without recognizing other beings as not necessarily moral agents, but as things that experience phenomenological experience. They could be moral patients. Like I could think that there's other minds, but that those other minds are not capable of exercising agency. I just don't understand how I could think I have a duty to other minds that I don't know exist. So that's still something I'm a bit confused on.
Yeah. Okay. So to the first point, it's in terms of like so it seems like it's your intuition that you think that the empathy is coming from some proto-utilitarian understanding rather than some proto-deontic understanding.
I wouldn't say. Would you mind if I like clarified a bit there? I wouldn't say intuition.
Sure.
I would more say that based upon our knowledge that hedonic states exist in, or our reasonable certainty, the inference we make that these animals experience pleasure and pain, and the comparative I would say like weaker evidence that they are able to experience feelings of like moral duty or obligation. It seems like you could count this as some sort of evidence, but I think like what cuts against it a bit is that it is pretty easily understood or explained, cashed out as being simply an expression of of personal pursuit of pleasure and pain on the part of those animals rather than being that right. If that makes any sort of sense.
Well, I don't. It makes sense. I just disagree that there are, because there are examples where there are the examples we're talking about are not examples that relate to the animal's own pleasure or pain. They're examples that relate to some sort of empathy, and the question is, what's the empathy stemming from? Is the empathy stemming from um, the understanding of their own pleasure or pain, or is this empathy stemming from something else? Some maybe a proto-deontic rights concern or whatnot. Now, there's certain like experiments that can be done. There are like certain brain scans that you can do with empathy. You can see like whether like, you know, in certain like empathetic actions, like some areas of the brain may light up to that are similar to like the utilitarian concerns, like with pleasure and pain. And there are sometimes there are certain actions like this that light up other areas of the brain that don't typically light up to just like things like pleasure and pain, like these areas that light up with love, for example, or at least similar to what people what have lit up when people say they're experiencing love, or just other things. So I mean, I don't. I mean, we could go into like, you know, functional MRI data and whatnot if you'd like. But I'm not convinced that all of these actions are going to be cashed out by some proto understanding of utility, rather than some other thing that's at work here. And to the second point, that you couldn't imagine it. Well, I mean, I'll point out one that's couldn't imagine it without any other minds. I'll just flag that and point out that's different than not imagining things without another society, because you could not have a society and have other minds. So then it would just be like, well, what would my values be if there were no other minds? And then let's just extrapolate that. I'm very worried about what my moral system would look like if that was my way of building it. I just build my moral system based on what values I might have as a solipsist, and now I just extrapolate that into a world with other minds, and then extrapolate that further into a world with a society.
Okay, so what do I respond to here first?
You can respond to the first one, the empirical data, functional MRI. We can go in like.
I guess like here's yeah. So I guess like I'm wondering, when you're saying when you're like appealing to this empirical data, is this empirical data meant to prove that these animals actually do have an understanding of some sort of like other being, or that they are showing these sorts of respect and these sorts of obligations without a knowledge of other minds? Like, I'm just like curious, like what exactly is being showing?
It's just meant it's just meant to show that there are it's just meant to show that there are actions that animals perform that don't seem where the empathy doesn't necessarily seem to be inextricably tied to an animal's feelings of understanding of pain or pleasure in themselves. That's all. There may be something else at play there. That's
and I
really
think you mentioned some other things. Like I think you might have mentioned feelings of. Did you say something like love, or please sure, like
I mean, like I don't have this data on hand right now.
Of course.
We can circle around. Yeah, but it's just things that don't seem to be understood or cashed out on a classical utilitarian view. You could always broaden utilitarianism to capture that further, but it doesn't seem to be the primitive work that's being done. Is just always in every case for these actions is going to be pleasure or pain.
Okay, so I think like when it comes to like that specific one, the empirical point of like the actions of animals, like if you're
Hmm.
okay with it, I think like at this point
Yeah.
we might have actually hit like something of like what I
Yeah.
mentioned before,
No, at this
bedrock on
point, if we
that
don't
specific
have,
one.
yeah, this would be the, yeah, this would be the bedrock. So, but and I think that would be a good, so we can like put a flag in that and we can like do a data exchange with like, functional MRI and whatnot. But, so that's fine. But to going back to the first question,
Yeah.
like, just imagine if, the data came out in such a way that it really was the case that there was some other concern other than utilitarianism, other than other than utility, that animals were performing these actions on. Are you now going to abandon utilitarianism for threshold deontology? Like, does
So
this really turn on that? Like,
when you say like other than utility, you mean like other
mhm.
than just the most basic idea of like feelings of pleasure and pain. And I guess like when I'm talking about like utility, I we could get like maybe into like the neuroscience of this. I'll be like I'll be straight up to admit like this is not the area that I am like particularly well versed in. It's an area I'm trying to
No,
learn more about.
I
But like
understand.
I don't see
Yeah,
like
yeah,
yeah, I'm like and we could talk more about like getting more into like the John Stuart Mill
no,
type of
it's
like
a
higher
principled.
order
It,
type of like
wait, Bentham,
values. Sorry,
real quick.
go on.
It's Yeah, it's a principled question. So I'm asking. Let's just say, for the sake of the argument, that if we look through the data, if we look through all these brain scans and whatnot, it just turned out to be the case that we could conclude with a very high degree of confidence that when animals perform actions that appear in the normative domain, they're not motivated primitively just by utilitarian concerns. There are other concerns, and it happens to be that those concerns could be cashed out under deontic rights, or at least a proto understanding of deontic rights. Let's just say that turned out to be the case. Like, are you now going to abandon utilitarianism and become a threshold deontologist? Like, is that really what would motivate your view to like jump ship? Because if yes, fair enough. If not, I just don't see why it's relevant. Like, why would we care? You see what I'm saying? With that, that's why I'm bringing up the why do we care question, because if that's really what this turns on, then if we had this empirical data and it showed that really this was the case, that that's what animals are doing when they perform certain actions, there are at least certain moral normative actions that animals engage in, such that, well, there are utilitarian concerns, but there are also non-utilitarian motivations and values that they have that just can happen to be cashed out deontically. Are you really going to jump ship? Is that what it's going to turn on? Then you're gonna be a threshold deontologist because they're both cashed out primitively now. It just happened to be we showed that was the case.
So if we could find that a creature that has no knowledge of the existence of other minds would value alongside utilitarian concerns something that could be cashed out as deontic concerns, then I think yes, I would. I think that the answer might be yes, that I would switch to some idea of threshold deontology because I view those deontic values as being equivalent in terms of reliability for capturing what it is I truly value as the utilitarian concerns. Because like the reason, I guess this
Okay.
is getting to the first question. Oh, did you want to cut in?
Yeah. The other, no, I acknowledged that you agreed with what follows from that. And if it turned out to be the case, like, let me just ask you this then. Like, here's where I'm gonna push this like principle to a little bit of a limit here. Let's just say hypothetically, and this is going to be a weird hypothetical, but bear with me. Let's just say hypothetically it turned out to be the case that that all of the primitive understandings, the primitive desires, the primitive values, let's just say hypothetically it turned out to be that they really were just egoists, and that really just they result in different actions in society because there are different norms that people develop in a societal context. Let's just say the brain scans showed that. say they showed that the norms are all egoists. Are you now going to be an egoist?
So when you say it turns out they were just all egoist, I'm not sure like what you exactly mean by that. Because like when I made my distinction, like I was saying that like for the rational mind that that does realize other minds exist, they recognize that which they value in themselves. Like I'm not sure how you could distinguish between
No, I
the
understand.
proto values that would create utilitarianism from the proto values that would create egoism when you're talking about the
No,
solipsist.
let's just say hypothetically. Yeah. Let's just say it's like it's just. I don't know how I would empirically do it either. But let's just say we had the empirical technology to do so. Like, let's just say we're in some futuristic world where we could map the entire brain out, and we just figured out that like, okay, what accounts for like these primitive actions? Like, it just so happens to be that all of these primitive actions are, regardless of whether there would be another individual or not, they just happen to be egoist. Let's just say we knew that for the sake of the argument.
So I'm gonna, like the response I'm going to have, like this isn't going to be like a very satisfying response for you, but I'd simply say that there is no difference between the motivations that would create egoist behavior versus the motivations that would create utilitarian behavior when you're talking about a solipsist. Because what they would see is like the one that would eventually become a utilitarian based upon thinking, oh, I've got these feelings, other beings have these feelings, so I should value their feelings. Like it would be exactly the same because for them, they would still be in a way utilitarianism, but n would equal
I'm
1.
granting that. I'm granting
I just
that,
don't see how you
that
could
doesn't
ever
escape.
prove.
It
I don't
doesn't
see how it's
escape.
logically
But it
possible
doesn't
to prove
escape.
this thing. Sorry,
Wait,
go
wait,
ahead.
wait. Okay,
Apologies.
okay. Well, I would avoid using the term logically possible because I'm just going to ask you for the propositions that form the contradiction if that's the case. But the point is that I grant that the answers could be the same for this context, but that's not going to escape the question here. The reason it's not going to escape that move doesn't escape the question is because when you give me an answer such that okay, well, I'm abiding by this primitive principle. Okay, fine, it's an egoist. However, in that case, I'm not going to. I mean, I see what you're saying in terms of like if you want to say like all the brain scans are going to be compatible with those two, and just the underdetermination is going to be the case. That's fine. I'm just going to expand the tech. I'm just going to say, well, let's just say there was an omnipotent being that knew the answer. Hypothetically, let's say there was this like omnipotent God or whatever that told you like, oh, actually, that couldn't lie. That told you actually, it turns out that the primitive values are egoist, and that it's just the societal values that import the non-egoist values in your mind. So the pragmatic shielding just gets wandered away there, like to avoid answering the question. So now what's the answer to the question? Are you going to be an egoist if it just turns out that those things that we're calling the primitive desires, the primitive values, are just egoist?
I'm trying to think of like the way I'm trying to think of the way to word the like my response to this because I'm trying to even think of like what it would mean for those primitive values to be egoist versus that for them to be utilitarian. And I will say like logic. I will say like I will like I'll go down this route of like logical impossibility because the way I see it is that you're trying to create a differentiation between two possible mental states that are exactly the same. I'd invoke like the law of identity that those are exactly the same as one another. That the single mind that believes it's in a single.
Hold on, wait, Bentham. When you say are exactly the same, what are we saying that? Look, the mental when I say exactly the same, I'm talking. Here's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the two different states of affairs. One state of so we understand what egoism is, and we understand what classical utilitarianism is, and how they differ, right?
Yes, like egoism is viewing only the good, only the pleasure and the good of the self, whereas utilitarianism is viewing the pleasure and the good of all conscious beings.
Okay, so do we understand how someone can have a mental state such that they value the pleasure and the good of themselves regardless of the pleasure of anyone else?
I can see how they would subjectively believe that what they're doing is consistent by like I would say
well,
that
no, that's not what I asked.
Sorry, go ahead.
That's not the question. Yeah. So the question is, can we imagine a world such that it really is the case, where someone's brain is wired in such a way, such that they really only value the pleasure and pain of themselves, regardless of what anyone else experiences at all? Can we imagine that?
Yes, we can imagine that they would
Okay.
only value their own pleasure. Yes.
Okay, cool. Now, can we also imagine that someone has a mental state such that they value their own pain and pleasure and the pain and pleasure of others?
Yes.
Now, let's just say, so these are two different mental states. We agree?
Yes.
Now, let's just say that that we looked and we saw a society, or not a society. We looked at some, beings that did not know of any other minds. Um, let's just say we looked at the neural wiring, and we saw, and it just turned out to be the case that we mapped out all the neural wirings, and it turns out that the neural wirings matched perfectly with the egoist neural wirings, and they did not match with any wiring confirmation that yields a mental state such that they don't value the such that they do not value the pain or suffering of other beings, actual or hypothetical. And even if they were experienced with other beings, even if they wouldn't. And it's only like in this society, or only in like certain, and it's only after being exposed to other beings or society that they form another value rather than it just being derivative. Let's just say we knew that that's just how the wiring was. Are you an egoist now? Bentham?
Sorry. I'm thinking through the answer
Mm-hmm.
to the question, and the answer to the question is that descriptively, yes, like what you're talking about. I'll agree. It is logically possible to make that sort of conclusion. But what I will say is that when you are taking that specific thing, this will sound like I'm just like repeating myself, but I do think that this is a real answer to this question. That when you are saying, I recognize other minds exist, I recognize that they experience the same pleasure sensations that I do. Like that person, like an egoist, is someone that can exist. They do exist. There are people who subscribe to that. But what I am arguing is that what you are doing there is logically inconsistent, because what you are doing
What's
in
the inconsistency?
the inconsistency is that you are valuing is that you are saying like that I am forced to experience and to value pleasure and pain. I'm forced to value utility. If we can say that we can capture that I
I'm
value
not.
these.
Wait.
Go on.
What? Wait. Hold on. The inconsistency is with what? What are you saying? There's an inconsistency in?
That they value the concepts of pleasure and pain, but do not extend that to creatures that they know experience pleasure and pain. That they
Why is that
arbitrarily,
inconsistent?
because like I said, what they are when they are valuing pleasure and pain, they're not valuing it in only
Oh,
themselves. They are
oh,
valuing its
oh. Just to be
presence.
clear,
They're
yeah,
valuing it as a
yeah,
concept.
yeah. So, let's just say there are individuals that don't value it as a general concept. They only value it for themselves, as a concept that only applies to themselves. That's what we mean by egoist.
I mean, yeah, I'd say like those people exist, but I think that what they're doing is they're applying an inconsistency to
Wait, but
that.
what's the inconsistency then? Because you can't say that they're valuing it as a general concept and they're only applying it to themselves. Let's just say they start off by only applying it to themselves. They say, well, I don't value it as a general concept. I only value it to myself. What's the inconsistency?
All right, for now, I will concede that there's not an inconsistency. There we go.
Okay. All right, cool. So then the question remains, if these states of affairs turned out to be the case for what we're calling the primitive values, are you gonna say you're an egoist now?
Um, sure, I'll say I'll say that I'm an egoist. Sure.
Okay, I'm gonna push the bullet. I'm gonna expand the bullet and make it harder to swallow. You swallowed that one. We're gonna come up with a harder bullet. Let's just say it turned out to be the case that the primitive values we're talking about are masochistic. Well, not just masochistic. Let's just say they're sadistic. Let's say there are certain primitive values. It just happened to be the case that when we analyze the world and we know everything, it turns out to be like what we thought about like people's primitive values was all wrong. And it turns out to be the primitive values that we're calling happen to be sadistic values. Really, real values that we just, we may value the pain or pleasure of ourselves, but we actually enjoy, we actually value causing other people suffering. As counterintuitive as that is, let's just say that happened to be the case. We just found out that was what the primitive values were for people and animals. However, upon seeing other individuals or upon living in a society, we realize a different value. It's not that we derive second order values from it. We just realize we come to have other values that are societally influenced or other individual influenced. Are you now a sadist?
Yes.
Okay. So that's where we're going to break apart here. So like if it just turned out, so like just to really push this, like if it turned out to be the case that we just had these primitive values to just torture everyone for as long as possible and to just like, you know, just skin them alive, rip their teeth out, flay, like, you know, stab them everywhere, burn their eyes or whatnot. Let's just say it turned out to be the case that these are the proto values. And then they just get overridden or go away upon entering society or upon learning of other minds. Like, are you in favor of just like, would you in principle be just in favor of just burning everyone and just stabbing everyone and skinning everyone alive? If you were presented with that data and it was conclusive.
So I guess what I'll say is that based upon all of my answers so far, yes, but that like at this point I realize that I need to appeal to something other than primitive values, and that is an insufficient basis for my for my moral judgments. And like from that point, I'm going to say, hey, I concede the debate to you, Avi, basically from that at that point. So like I'm not going to go and say
Okay.
like, hey, I actually do believe these things, because at that point I'm just like valuing consistency over the over my actual preferences, and I'll say that no, I'm not going to do that because like I'm realizing, and thank you, like I genuinely thank you for doing this, that appealing only to those sort of base instincts is not going to create a moral system that actually meets my preferences, and because of that, it means that I have some other value I need to find and appeal to instead.
Okay. Well, listen, thank you. I appreciate the intellectual honesty. And yeah, thank you for that. That was, yeah, I appreciate you not, because some people do this and they dig their heels in the sand and it gets really weird and cringy. So thank you for not doing that. Um, Now let us tell you about the doctrine of threshold deontology and how you can join the fold.
I
um, yeah, this is the coming to Jesus moment, Bentham. Um, yeah, no, it's okay. Yeah, so the point is the point here is, Bentham, is just yeah, it's just like why, like just imagine like what the, like why, yeah, it's just the why we should care question. It's just like imagine what would follow if we only cared about um the norms that arise in these primitive situations. Like just imagine like why we should care about that. Like, if it just turned out to be something horrible, like, we wouldn't call ourselves as subscribing to those norms. And you can say, well, maybe that's just your society telling you to not murder everyone and torture everyone and skin them all alive. Well, maybe it fucking is, but who the fuck cares? If that's what it is, go for it. Go society then.
So yeah, like I guess like I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but I guess like the needle I want to thread, and I unfortunately initially did it by appealing only to, throughout this I've appealing only to like primitive values, but I realize now that like that does have the same, if not more, like issues than appealing to the socially constructed values, is how do you thread that needle between sort of replicating your current, we're replicating basically the society that you live within versus trying to
I'm sorry, Bentham, you're just breaking up a little bit.
I'm so sorry. Can you hear me? Can you hear me better now?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay. So I guess like the issue then is threading that needle and finding the medium between like what I was initially saying of literally only valuing the primitive desires versus replicating the socially constructed values of your society. Because like I think we both can agree that those socially constructed values can be damaging themselves, just as like I think we can now agree that replicating primitive values can also be damaging. And so I guess like that's the issue I still have that makes me hesitant towards threshold deontology, because I still do worry that importing those deontic obligations will result in a replication of possibly harmful social constructs.
Well,
Apologies.
Well, maybe it won't. Maybe that is the needle. Maybe that is the balance, because maybe you could be right, and it turns out that maybe these primitive things are really just utilitarian. But maybe these deontic concerns turn out to not be utilitarian. Maybe that's just the way the data comes out. But if that is the way the data comes out, maybe that is a balance. Maybe there are societal obligations or rights that people can import into their system. However, they can be overcome or surmounted with enough of the primitive norms. So to me, I actually think threshold deontology may actually be the thing that does thread that balance. Because think of what it would be to be only having the societal values that you're talking about in terms of rights. So it seems like if you were to just cash that out in terms of rights, then you'd just be a pure deontologist and ignore the primitive. If you're only doing the primitive, you just maybe be a pure utilitarian if that just happens to be the only thing that's primitive. But it seems to be that if you desire to thread them such that they both matter, well, have the cluster concept. Value them both, and you can have some situation in which there's different ways you can value them. But it seems like that actually would be the approach to thread the balance between the primitive and the non-primitive.
Quite possibly. So I think now's a good time to possibly end it, because I gotta go. I gotta go and eat dinner. But I want to thank you so much for this opportunity and for the opportunity to speak with you and to talk about this. And I learned something. So thank you. And if there's one thing I could give you in terms of like maybe like I didn't get the chance to like talk at all about him, but one utilitarian thinker that might be interesting, maybe just like read a little bit about him, is Henry Sedgwick. He has some really interesting ideas specifically about how somebody from a utilitarian standpoint can live within a society. So if you're just wanting to learn from a utilitarian that was quite a bit smarter, more well-educated than myself, that'd be someone to look into just for a pretty rigorous perspective on utilitarian philosophy. If you happen to, in your ample free time.
Yeah, for sure. No, it would. Yeah, it would be interesting. My issues, like a lot of my issues, though I'll say a lot of my issues with utilitarianism are not in societal context, but are still motivating enough for me to abandon utilitarianism. It's a lot of the issues that motivated me are specifically the issues that are outside society rather than inside society. So I'm not sure if he would persuade me, but hey, I'm happy with being able to
I don't
look. But
necessarily
anyway,
mean
listen,
like to persuade you, just from an
oh,
interesting
I see what you're
perspective
saying.
on
Just
something.
interest.
I'm not saying you have to adopt it.
Gotcha. Yeah. All
All
right.
right.
Well, listen. Like, thanks for the talk. And listen, I one thing I'll tell you is I very much appreciate your intellectual honesty here, and thank you for not digging your heels into the sand on all of those crazy bullets. So I appreciate. There are a lot of people who would do that just for the sake of winning the debate, or at least maintaining a position in the debate, even if it wouldn't be intellectually honest. So it means a lot for you to me for you to be intellectually honest. So props.
All right. Thank you. Goodbye. Thank you so much, and you have a nice evening.
You as well. Take care.